It is Sunday, August 19th, and this is the Antifada. I am Sean KB, broadcasting live from Left is Best Studio, just steps from the industrial-ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA.
Why are you doing this to me?
Just to troll you on your day off.
I feel like I'm back at work, all right?
Sorry.
Do I not go to work enough for you?
In that J Mastodon guy's voice? What's the guy you say?
J Mascot? Oh, John Benjamin.
The singer of
H.
Mastodon.
John
The singer of
John
Mastodon.
Oh, don't
no.
get me started on Mastodon. That's going to take me down a whole
Do you like
other
what
road.
you see, America?
Take two.
Look in the mirror, America.
Christ.
Do you like what you see?
It's the Communist Report with Sean and Jamie and AP Andy.
Recording live from Left is Best Studio.
Recording live from the People's Republic of newly liberated Left is Best Studios.
That's right. And
If left is best, maybe leftist is bestest?
maybe.
If anybody needs some equipment, come on down. It's all for the people.
It's all for the people. This is how hip-hop was created in the 70s, in the blackout, when everybody stole all the equipment that they needed in order to do awesome fucking music. So listen, folks, come down, downtown Brooklyn, fire sale. Everything's for free. It's an anarchist free market.
We did a banner drop. It's all good. It's all good in the hood, folks.
That's it.
And you know what? I think Sam will understand.
Listen, he was going to get expropriated eventually anyways. I mean, at least we're announcing it beforehand, so when he shows
Yeah.
up to work, you know, he'll know.
Yeah, well, maybe now he'll realize that the people on Fox News were right, and democratic socialism is, in fact, a slippery slope to killing him and all of his family.
Well, listen, expropriating Sam was democratic socialism because we voted unanimously to expropriate the studio today.
Yeah.
What's more democratic than that?
Yeah, I mean, people grow up with these concepts of bourgeois representative democracy that are actually very far removed from what direct democracy really means.
That's right. And also direct action. And we got so many goods, folks. Come on down to downtown Brooklyn. Direct action got you the goods. May 1,000 podcasts bloom.
That'll be the real test of whether Sam listens to this show.
You'll know real fast if he listens to this fucking show. Jamie, I heard what you said on the podcast. You can't expropriate me, can you see?
Yeah, I mean, can't is a relative term.
Yeah, well. Maybe we might need a social revolution before you can expropriate your boss, but you know what? Till then, we'll just keep on podding.
Yeah, and you know what?
They see me podding, they hate me.
He's one of the good ones. Like, he gets re-education, hands
dude,
down.
There's no way he's getting fucking within 100 feet of a gulag.
No, he's...
That man we will set him on his feet, set him straight. He will renounce his capitalist ways, and he will join us in the great proletarian revolution as a comrade and friend, because his heart's in the right place.
Sam, I'm putting the mini amp back out of my bag. I'm sorry.
Oh, my God.
And
well...
he's taking out his Mini 14 to start sniping people.
I feel like, oh, wow. I feel like Sam could get down with some kind of, like, Soviet-style bureaucracy.
Oh, fuck
like,
yeah.
he lives for that shit.
Yo, he would be like a one-man Goss plan. Like, you talk about socialist planning, Sam could sit there with some actuarial tables and just, like, work out an entire fucking socialist planned economy.
Comrade Cedar.
That's it.
You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah.
All right, so I guess we are starting the show now.
Yeah. All right, fine.
This is... If anyone listening is confused, this is not actually the Majority Report. It is the Antifada. And
This is the Militant Minority Report.
hello and welcome to the Antifada. I'm Jamie Peck.
I am Sean KB.
And I'm AP Andy.
And we are here with a very special guest today, Army Resistor Spenser Rapone.
Yeah, glad to be here in the heart of the revolution in downtown Brooklyn. Thanks for having me.
Hell yeah, thanks for
yeah.
coming.
The revolution will have gaudy luxury high-rises popping up all over the place at all times, just like downtown Brooklyn.
Yeah, luxury condos for all. Only they won't be condos. They'll be commos. Yeah.
Cut that out.
Remember that. Oh my God. I'm sorry,
I
guys.
saw where you were going. It was good. It was good.
It'll be combos, the snack.
Combos, yeah. I really like the pretzel ones with the cheddar inside.
That's
wonderful. Or the
that's
pizza
the
ones are
combo.
pretty good.
The
too.
pizza ones are the pepperoni pizza are vegan actually.
Oh, yeah.
Or vegetarian. I
I
should
find-
say. It's not real pepperoni.
I find it unnerving.
Combos?
I don't like the taste of pepperoni in my combos.
Oh, that's fair.
Anyway.
It's a great snack for the road, though, I must say.
The best.
So, I would like to start out by asking you a question we ask all our guests here at the Antifada.
Hey, babe, can I ask it this time?
Sure. Go
Okay,
for it.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Spencer, we'd like to start out by asking our guest something we ask everybody when they come on the Antifada. What is your favorite Clash song?
Well, it's tough because my favorite album is Sandinista, which is a bit of a hot take in the punk rock community.
Pretty
But
spicy, yeah.
it is pretty spicy. But I'd have to say it's Washington Bullet, solely because it is, I would say, the most anti-imperialist song, and it kind of was almost a gateway into socialist politics for me at a young age.
Dead
Hell
ass.
yeah.
That's
We-
awesome.
We like to talk a lot here about the different ways that people can get radicalized through music and what music was important to us in our political development. So,
Oh, yeah.
Well, I gotta say, I gotta throw out Spanish Bombs. I know it's a little cliche, but I think both Andy and I are both kind of like more traditionalist Clash fans.
Yeah.
And Spanish Bombs is amazing. It's not only catchy, it's actually not even like the punkest of all punk songs, right? Like the stuff of the self-title is way more like 3-chord, like classic punk rock. But
right.
it is like a more like poppy song. But I love how it combines a really fun sort of like take on, not fun, but interesting take on the Spanish Civil War of the 30s, but also kind of combines it to the Sandinista Central American struggles that are happening at that time.
I like a handful of songs on Sandinista a lot, and my least favorite song is Lost in the Supermarket.
Really? I actually like that song a
I
lot.
think that song is hot garbage.
Why?
Wow.
So as
Andy
it's
with the
not strong,
spicy
like the
take.
spectrum.
Oh, man.
I think Lose the Skin is my favorite Clash song, and Supermarket is my least favorite.
That isn't. I actually resent that because I really do like that song. Is it because Strummer doesn't sing it, or is it because you don't like the vulgar anti-consumerism of it?
Yeah, I don't like people saying it's actually a situationist song. And
Oh, that's a thing.
I just think
Oh,
that
that's
album is like
interesting,
too
yeah.
poppy.
Yeah,
it is.
I'm more of a Sex Pistols guy too, so I need it to be like really
Oh.
snotty and
Okay, so
stupid.
so you wanted like you like manufactured punk bands that are
Yeah.
all like spectacle and no content.
Yeah, and didn't Sid Vicious come out as like a chud?
They were always
oh,
their
no,
second song.
Or
on-
Johnny Rotten.
Johnny
right?
Rotten.
Sid's been dead.
So
Yeah.
Sid
Yeah.
Vicious came out as a dead guy.
Yeah, right. But all of them never really had like an explicit social critique. It was more just kind of this aesthetic variety.
Well,
of rebellion.
Holiday in
Yeah.
the Sun is a great song, like a very interesting take on the bipolarity of the Cold War. And the second song is just an anti-abortion song.
Yeah.
Bodies.
Oh, jeez. I mean, I think the Clash is pretty good and stuff, but I really must say lately I've really been jamming on the anthem "Sky Rockets in Flight," "Afternoon Delight"
Oh.
by the celebrated anarcho-syndicalist brigadiers, the Starland Vocal Band.
They were hardcore. They tried to actually unionize the Grand Ole Opry. It was a militant struggle, and they got, I think, 2 or 3 people out of 400 to vote for a radical syndicalist union.
Sex at 2 p.m. is every worker's right.
Dead ass.
Dead fucking ass. We can get Jamie, can we get a famous hell yeah for that?
Hell yeah.
That's what's up.
Hell yeah.
So after that little sidebar, do you want to ask the actual question we always ask?
Oh yeah. Yeah, here's a question we also another question we like to ask our guests here at the Antifada. Miraculously enough, it hasn't gotten old yet. And that question is, how pure is your hate today?
My hate is the purest of hate, flowing through my veins, from my heart down to my appendages.
Fuck.
Pure hate.
Hell yeah.
Hell
Is there
yeah.
even any hate like left for your organs? Are you like in like constant like terminal
Just
sort of
permanent
shock?
priapistic hate on.
Yes, exactly. Just pure, unbridled hatred. My body's about to collapse from the amount of hate I have.
I fucking love it. Well, we have EMTs on hand, so if you do need help, medical help, we got you. But falling out from hate stroke is a common occurrence on the show, so we always come prepared with EMTs. So don't worry, we got your back.
Yeah. They fixed up Matt Crispin really nice. So
Yeah, they got him an Ativan drip to,
they'll
balance his hatred levels.
they'll take care of you. I must say, Sean and I both have a little bit of cat-related hate going on today.
Oh yeah, just today.
We have Yeah, I mean, we have a pretty tortured relationship, I would say.
Well,
with
we've
the,
only mentioned I think 7 times on the show that we want to drown our cats in the bathtub
little
with a
fascists,
pillowcase. Yes.
the fascists of our home.
Yeah.
Constant race war. So yesterday I woke up. I wasn't sleeping. I was in that kind of liminal state between like after you wake up, but you're too sleepy to get out of bed yet. And
which actually you should know lasts for about 7 hours a day for her.
It's usually a fugue state for me, but I know you're coming from.
Yeah.
None of us are morning people.
Yeah.
So I was rudely roused out of that by
Oh my God, this is so traumatic.
our cat Frida Gatto, who had gotten up on the dresser and was trying to drink out of my glass of water on the dresser that I use as a bedside table. Only I think she's got some whiskers missing or something because she has very bad balance for a
Very
cat.
bad balance,
And she
that's true.
just fucking fell off of the dresser
Oh, wow.
and grabbed onto my face with her claws on the way down
damn.
and just like hooked me like a fish.
Vicious.
And now I have a cut in my mouth.
She comes out of the fucking bedroom like I'm in the living room. She comes out and she's like, "Oh, you'll never believe what happened." And I thought it was one of her typical like, you know, overreactive sort of things that Jamie sometimes does when she wakes up. Then she's like, "The cat hooked my face," and I'm like, "Jesus fucking Christ! I've never heard of such a
I
thing."
was bleeding from my mouth.
I mean, you'd think that Frida Gatto, you know, having slept with Trotsky and all, would have like a non-propaganda the deed, you know, like anarchist line on this sort of thing, but she just went straight after you. It was terrorism, really, anarchist terrorism. She's like Angry Brigade up in our shit.
Yep.
I mean, is she an older cat? Like how?
No.
Wow.
She was very small when we found her in the shaft of our building. I'd say she's at the most 2 years old.
Since you're new to New York, Spencer, and congratulations and welcome to our
Thank
fair
Oh,
you.
yes.
town.
You just moved to New York
Indeed.
recently. We should have mentioned.
Joining all the socialites. Yeah.
Yeah, and socialists. It's
Yeah.
actually we're pleased that it's such a left city.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, you are legally required to live in New York if you have a leftist podcast.
Right,
So,
yes.
welcome.
Yeah.
And if
sign the
not, you
contract.
go elsewhere and you just like online just completely obsess about the New York City podcast scene.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's way more important than it actually is.
Yeah, that's praxis, folks.
It is.
But yeah, as a new resident to our city, you're going to discover all sorts of wonderful things like piss on the sidewalks and feces, trash everywhere, rats, roaches, and also the air shaft, which is something in between dumbbell apartments that people throw various, you know, refuse into, including in our case, cats.
Yeah,
kittens.
I went to go get a coffee this morning wearing shorts. So it rained a little bit. I got some good garbage water splash on my legs. So
That's actually the official New York City welcome. So
right.
that means there is vacancy.
I actually saw the first public masturbator that I'd seen in a while while I was walking home last night.
Ooh.
And I looked over and I was like, oh, New York's not dead.
16 years in your first public masturbator?
Well, no, it wasn't the first. I said it was the
Oh.
first in a while.
Okay, all right,
Babe,
fair.
look, I think the last one I saw was like, I mean, I don't want to go too far afield here, but
So, well, Spencer, like the point of her story is that you're here now, you're a leftist, you're in the best city in the country, maybe the world, and you have to become a public masturbator.
Right. Just
so
like
work
the
on it.
Coney 2012 guy.
De Blasio made it legal.
Yeah.
He did make it legal after the Coney
he's
20
good for something.
after the Coney 2012 guy showed us the shining path
Mm-hmm.
to liberation.
That's right.
So we talk about a lot of depressing shit here at the Antifada, and, you know, it's par for the course. We live in a depressing world. But
True.
I would like to combat the idea that all we ever do is bitch and complain. So starting now, and I think we've been doing it a little bit just organically, I would like to spotlight a little bit of good news
Yeah, that's a really good idea.
from the week. Yeah,
A little some warm fuzzies.
So
ASMR they call it, I think,
ASMR for the heart, for the soul.
For the-
ASMR for the soul.
for the Antifada mindset.
Exactly. So on that note, I would like to spotlight a little bright spot in all of our weeks, in which the singer from Social Distortion, Mike Ness, was
Great band, great comrade.
playing a concert, and there was a MAGA chud in the audience who didn't like what he had to say about our president. Well, not my president, but you know. And the singer, Mike Ness, responded in what I would say was in a fairly appropriate way.
So Folks can't see this at home, but they're playing on stage. Ooh, the music stops. What's happening now? Mike Ness is getting off the stage.
If you couldn't hear what that guy shouted, it was "Kick his ass, Mike."
Hell yeah.
They came out of a song, and then I guess he wrote another song about racist America or something along those lines. And before the song, he had this big intro of how horrible and racist America is, how
Where's the
America, everyone
Show me the line.
in America is racist.
And he said it in a bad way.
Then he started talking about Trump and ICE and just the normal left critic of how he's a bigot and racist, and the detention camps for ICE and all the lies that everyone been hearing. And
So that's this, you can't see him obviously because we're on audio.
He has a ham for a head.
He does have a ham for a head.
All
He's
these
like-
motherfuckers look the same. He looks like if Baked Alaska ate another Baked Alaska.
He really does.
He's got a neck beard. I mean, just imagine like prototypical like dictionary definition of MAGA chud, and this is the guy. So, he's talking about what led up to this event, and now he's going to talk about what Mike Ness did in response.
and proceeds to punch me multiple times in the head. No, he spit in my face, and of course I got upset at that, and yelled at him about it. And he jumps off, takes his guitar off, jumps off stage, punches me multiple times in the head, gets pulled off from the security behind the fence, breaks free from that, punches me, gets a couple more punches in, and then gets pushed back up onto stage.
That's the most I've seen Andy smile at a video clip in our entire time together.
That's what a certain internet message board calls salt. It's when you enjoy the tears of a vanquished foe.
Oh, yes.
okay.
Alt-right tears, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm vaguely familiar with that. So, Spencer, do you think it's fair to give Mike Ness the Proletarian Hero of Socialist Labor medal this week?
Absolutely. I'd love to award it to him myself.
Oh, that's a great fucking idea. So maybe we'll have another show with Mike Ness and Spencer, because I've been a Social Distortion fan for a long fucking time. Great band, and apparently just based Antifa.
Right.
That's what's up.
Antifada mindset. That's what's up. So Spencer's presence on our show today is at least partly the result of a serendipitous meeting at the Socialism 2018 conference. I think we actually did reach out to him before that, but after meeting him and hanging out a little bit, I decided to make it a priority.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
And I saw him do a very good talk with Rory Fanning, which was actually one of my favorite ones of the whole conference, about his story and the role of imperialism in the global capitalist project. And, well, we'll get into more of the meat of those topics later. But I was very impressed by it. And I was like, you know what? We got to have this guy on.
Yeah, Rory Fanning, for those of you who may not know, is a war resistor himself from 2004, and he wrote a book called Worth Fighting For, An Army Ranger's Journey Out of the Military and Across America, and it chronicles his own resistance story, and him and I had been corresponding for a while, and when I finally took my steps of getting out, he's helped me along that path, and we decided to call our panel a war resistor in the ranks, and we discussed the different topics that Jamie just alluded to.
Hell yeah. So I feel like you've told your story a bunch of times already, but do you want to just briefly summarize what went down, how you got yourself into and then out of the military and all that good stuff?
Sure. I'll give you the bottom line up front was I enlisted in the Army, in the infantry right outside of high school in 2010. While in basic training, I got a contract to join the Rangers, made it through that selection process, deployed to Afghanistan in the summer of 2011, was horrified with what I saw, didn't like it, wanted to find a way to change things from the inside at the time because I didn't really have a coherent socialist framework or an anti-imperialist framework yet. So I decided I would apply to West Point. I got accepted. During my time at West Point, I realized that the issue with the military was not a few bad personalities, but more of a structural phenomenon and it wasn't just the military itself. It was directly linked to the capitalist mode of production. And from there, I kind of was stuck because after your first 2 years at West Point, you're bound to a contract wherein if you decide to leave, you have to either give more enlisted time or find a way to foot a $250,000 bill. So I kind of told myself I'd find my own enclave within the military and do my work to prevent bad things from happening. But of course, I knew that wouldn't, be possible in the long run. So I graduate West Point, commission as an officer, as an infantry officer, and then while at Fort Benning, Georgia, for like the 17th time, again, I start to understand the contradictions that were inherent in my earlier years in the Army in a more tangible way. And from there, I start to kind of grapple with how I could get out of the Army, maybe raise the issue of the military's role in imperialism overseas, what we're actually doing there. And I was searching for an opening. At that time, Colin Kaepernick had just begun protesting police brutality and white supremacy in the United States. So this would have been like the fall of 2016. And incidentally, Rory Fanning himself tweeted out something that went viral of him in his old battle dress uniform blouse with a sign that said "Veterans sitting with Kaepernick" in support of Kaepernick's efforts. And I kept my finger on that pulse for a while. And a year later, in September of 2017, it was a little bit different because, of course, Trump had gotten elected, and while imperialism continued all the same from Bush to Obama and so on, Trump for me marked a particular heightening of the contradictions. I had taken a couple of photos at my graduation that could be considered subversive, and I figured I'd throw my support for Kaepernick because he had put some skin in the game. He lost his career and livelihood in order to speak truth to power, and I tweeted out my own Veterans for Kaepernick bit, and from there I got put under investigation. I was flagged by my chain of command.
Oh, and I'm sorry, just to clarify, what was your Veterans for Kaepernick bit exactly?
It was me in my full dress uniform at graduation, displaying a sign within my hat that said "Communism will win." And then also a picture of me opening up that uniform to show a Che Guevara t-shirt underneath. And then from there, I kind of went through the whole legal process. I got charges brought up against me by the Army, such as conduct unbecoming of an officer for, speaking out against public officials as a member of the military. And essentially, they gave me a choice. I could stand trial on what's called a board of inquiry, which would have just been this circus act where they wouldn't have heard me out, or I could submit my resignation, and I decided to submit my resignation. They issued me an other than honorable discharge, and I was out of the Army on June 18th of this year.
So you really did put a lot on the line for that, because obviously a lot of folks in this country rely on the benefits that the military provides in terms of economic and educational opportunity. A question for you is, as I was looking this up, with a other than honorable discharge, since you re-enlisted, are you still eligible for the benefits that you had before?
Yeah, I am. So part of the reason why I wanted to get out ASAP was I have an honorable discharge from my enlisted time when I was in the Rangers. So although it's not as good as the benefits would have been if I got my full benefits from my officer time, I still qualified for the GI Bill and some of the basic health care programs that the VA offers.
That's great.
Oh, yeah.
I did not know that. So if you guys want to know more about Spenser's personal story, you can check out, really any of the podcasts he's been on recently, but especially his own newly launched podcast. It's called Eyes Left, that he does with a guy named Mike Preisner. And it's I checked it out last night. It's very good.
We both listened to it, and everybody definitely go check out at least episode 1, because not only are they smart and not only are they radical, but they're doing a really great political project and a really awesome intervention, I think, at this moment where we need more and more voices out there.
Yeah, and
plus your sound quality is really good. I don't know how you did that so fast. Good job.
That's all Mike. I'm just speaking, but he handles all that stuff. So
all right, ups to Mike.
Big ups to Mike. So yeah, that leads me into another thing that I wanted to ask you, which is, what are you trying to achieve with this new media project?
So Mike approached me with the project, and for us, it's in the spirit of a lot of the GI resistance newspapers and pamphlets that were quite prevalent during the Vietnam era. And of course, media has changed since then, and there are other military podcasts that are out there, but we thought, given both of our roles as explicit anti-war figures and as war resistors in general, that we could, provide a platform of sorts for active duty soldiers or veterans who might be feeling as we feel. Mike, of course, he was at the forefront of Iraq veterans against the war over 10 years ago, and he's been at it for a while. He's been a member of PSL for that long as well.
That's Party for Socialism and Liberation, for
Yep.
folks who don't know.
Yeah, and so what we're trying to accomplish with it is, letting the active duty military personnel know that they have certain rights afforded to them, and they have an ability to resist the military. Now, it's going to be different from person to person, but you don't have to deploy. You don't have to go kill for the military-industrial complex. There is a way out, and both of us are proof of that. And whether they want to do it anonymously or more explicitly, we could help them in those efforts.
That's great.
Yeah, that was one thing that I thought was really interesting about Eyes Left is you and your co-host are constantly reaching out to any active duty listeners that you might have and encouraging them to leave. You talk to them almost as if they're in a cult.
Yes.
Like you say, reach out to us. We'll talk you through it. You don't have to do this.
Right.
And I think that's a very, kind and generous thing to do. At the same time, I wonder if there's also a strategy to having a lot of woke people in the military to disobey orders.
Certainly. Yeah, no, and I think that's a very valid statement to make, because I always, when I talk with people who are in right now and they say, well, what do I do? A lot of it depends on whether you're an officer, whether you're enlisted, whether you're involved in infantry directly, or you're kind of in more of a support role. Everyone has an important role to play in, formulating a resistance movement in the 21st century. So we've gotten a number of emails from certain people, and those who are maybe still early on in their contract, we start to, we kind of tell them there might be the best route for you might be getting out right now, doing whether it's conscientious objector status or another route. But if someone's maybe towards the end of their enlistment contract or in like a reservist capacity, I've, told people, hey, you might have a better chance of just kind of talking with people in your unit and explaining to them the role of the military and who you're actually beholden to in terms of your relation to power. So yeah, it's a little bit more complicated and sophisticated than just saying, hey, get out right now. And we're trying to work on answering those questions in the most, specific way possible.
Yeah, that's really good. And it brings me to another thing I was going to ask you. The project of getting people to leave or not join the military in the first place, I think, is a valuable one. I found it really touching at the Q&A portion of your talk at the Socialism Conference when, all of it was touching, but one really amazing moment was when a young woman got up and said that Rory Fanning, his work had actually helped her decide to not sign the papers, and she was about to enlist in the military, and then she didn't go, and everyone applauded, and It was really amazing, and it must have been especially amazing for Rory. But then again, I think about all of the coercive economic pressures that are driving people to join the military in the first place, and you probably don't have a complete answer to this because there isn't one, but how do you help people who are dealing with those factors figure out what they can do instead to support themselves and have a good life?
Yeah. So I think there's a dual character to it. One of it is acknowledging that their desire to join because of various forms of economic issues or some of the social programs the military offer are quite enticing. So acknowledging that that's completely valid and you understand, I think is important. But also, you had to articulate in a way that isn't just scaremongering what your actual function is as a soldier. Even if you're not pulling the trigger, whatever job you have in the military is to aid the objective of killing other human beings. And when you kind of explain to them what human beings are killing and how it's completely divorced from any of these nebulous ideas of democracy or freedom or, the classic Americana ideology, it becomes a little bit more tangible, the reality of what you're facing. But, me, I was a pretty headstrong 18-year-old kid, and I didn't really listen too much to a lot of people who told me not to join. So a lot of times people are just going to have to figure it out for themselves. But at the very least, you could tell them to arm themselves with a critical mind and at least not take everything at face value when they're in the military machine itself.
In terms of the question of what would people do in lieu of the sort of economic benefits that you get from being in the military, I have to imagine that your solution to that is tied up with your understanding of capitalism and imperialism being intertwined, right? So the question, of course, would be, why are people in such a bad way that they have to go kill people overseas in order to get, say, the GI Bill, education,
precisely.
or healthcare? Or
Yeah, I actually made that point in my talk itself, saying that any type of anti-war movement, and this also kind of doubles as my critique of some of the anti-war movements of the past 15 years, it has to be directly linked to a larger socialist project, because until we grapple with capitalism on a systemic level, there's always going to be that impulse to join the military for those social programs. So until we have a vibrant, authentic socialist movement, we're not going to really be able to adequately answer the question of anti-war and anti-imperialism.
Yeah, so I think the relationship between capitalism and war is not always readily apparent. I know there are a lot of liberals who are anti-war just on a very basic human basis of feeling that it's wrong to go and kill people overseas for whatever reason, but they might not precisely make the connection. I mean, I know I didn't at first. Like, when I was protesting the Iraq War in high school, I was part of Food Not Bombs, but they didn't always have the most detailed systemic critique. I don't want to throw shade. I love Food Not Bombs, but yeah. So like maybe you guys can go through a little bit and kind of lay out the connection between capitalism and imperialism and why they necessarily reinforce one another.
I want to comment on what you said about this sort of shallow anti-imperialism or anti-war. I think it's important to have a structural critique, but like the famous Marxist Bob Fitch said, vulgar Marxism explains 90% of the world. Vulgar anti-war also, does a lot of work too. So, I'm a veteran of the 2003 anti-Iraq war movement. Which was very disheartening, but it happened. And it didn't matter at that point in time when people came together then, or even now, right? Whether they're coming at it from no blood for oil, perspective, or a down with the military-industrial complex, not necessarily capitalism, but that, or if they're blaming, these neocon hawks that brought us into these wars, or even like Obama, as they call them. It doesn't really matter, right? In the sense that if people are brought to that position and they're mobilized and they're out in the streets, that in and of itself is important. I think for us, any true massive anti-war movement will have a militant minority that does have a structural critique, and that's what I want to tease out for us and our listeners, is something deeper than that. Of course, these things are descriptive, but we want to get analytical about it.
Certainly. To speak to your issue with a lot of the elements of the anti-war movement that didn't have that structural critique, I just got back recently from the About Face Veterans Against the War conference. We had it in Seattle, and they're formerly were known as Iraq Veterans Against the War, but they've since expanded to include more veterans. But that was actually one of our main debates we were having, because in many ways, the anti-war movement of the past 15 years has been that of failure, because we're still entrenched in Afghanistan now more than ever. Iraq, President Obama promised us that we would be out of it, but we're seeing a presence there that maintained itself and now is increasing once again. And of course, most importantly, the mission creep happening in Syria right now and various other army units in Africa and around the world.
Not to mention our proxies, of course, who act on our behalf across the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia and Yemen, or various African or Asian powers. So Spenser, you said something really interesting before I want to call back to, which is that you said for you and your experience that the election of Trump was this sort of heightening of the contradictions, right? It sort of spurred you on to realize that something was seriously wrong and to look for a structural critique. So I think a good project for us to do here, similar to what you did in your experience, is to try to formulate the structural analysis for the folks out there who are encountering this story and maybe thinking for the first time about this connection between capitalist accumulation on the one hand and war and imperialism on the other. I mentioned before this vulgar anti-imperialism, which expressed itself in 2003, and as you said, I think quite correctly, was a huge failure. I think that we need to do better. So, a structural analysis of contemporary imperialism is key, right? And within that, it's not simply that imperialism exists alongside capitalism. It's that there's this sort of dialectical process. There are these two interconnected processes that work together. So it's a little tough because, the laws of motion of capitalism is this sort of molecular process of competing capitalist powers, trying to, basically win over profits in one spot, undercutting the other over there. But of course, opening markets is super important, and having a stream of commodities is super important. Now, on the other hand, with the imperialist aspect, you have this kind of centralized power, not this anarchic capitalist system, but you have this centralized power of the bourgeois state that can use violence not only at home, right, as we have seen, but also abroad in order to make the world safe for profit making, essentially. But in terms of capitalist imperialism, the United States became the capitalist hegemon in the world.
And we should note that this was a bipartisan project, right?
Oh, indeed, yeah.
There was not a huge difference in foreign policy between Democrats and Republicans
Without question.
as the years have gone on. And there is I would say, the military establishment is pretty bipartisan in nature.
100%, and I think if you look at it, actually, the Democrats have been more hawkish through that history than even the Republicans have. It's definitely a bipartisan project, which I think goes to show that we have two wings of capital within our political system in the United States. But the important thing, right, is that this power that America holds as the global imperialist capitalist hegemon, it's not merely expressed in military means, right? It's not just Korea or Vietnam or Iraq, and it's also not, CIA operations like we saw in independent developing countries like, Iran under Mossadegh or Allende in Chile, these famous examples. What really separates the neo-imperialism of the United States from former modes of, global domination like settler colonialism, how we were made here in the United States, and direct foreign rule like the UK and India, is this conception of hegemony, right? So hegemonic power is not just that military force, right? But it also utilizes soft power and coercion as well, right, across the globe. Crucially, what American hegemony has done, as British hegemony did before that, is it pulls other nation states into its orbit. And it does that by creating a global system with institutions, right? International institutions. We see this with NATO, we see this with the IMF, and we see this increasingly with NGOs, right? Non-governmental organizations, seemingly non-political, but part of the project. And so the United States in this imperial project has been able to set the rules and the guidelines that benefit not just U.S. corporations, right, whether they be military or otherwise, but international accumulation of capital across the globe. There is a stick, within this imperialist structure, and we saw this in Afghanistan, and we saw this in Iraq, right? But there, of course, is also a carrot. That carrot is access to markets, access to capital, protection from aggression through things like NATO or, of course, our pacts over in East Asia, and basically a force in the world that guarantees a sufficient rate of profit for the capitalist system as a whole, even if those gains are primarily in the imperialist core, right, in the United States over the last 40, 50, 60 years, right? As long as this imperial hegemon can provide these subordinate states with a portion of the proceeds of that empire through its economic force and its military force, the system as it exists is accepted in these other core capitalist countries, advanced capitalist countries, even as it's fought very bitterly and heroically in the periphery by people who suffer under it. A lot of people say, Afghanistan and Iraq and all these proxy wars that are existing now, they show that the United States is returning back to this imperial heyday. We're using our hard power around the globe. But what I would argue is that while Afghanistan and Iraq and the war on terror, it may seem like basically a reassertion of U.S. Imperial power, it's, and I think, actually a reflection of our decline. It's sort of like, as we economically have less and less sway over the world, as we militarily overstretch ourselves across the entire globe, spending more and more of our gross national product on military in an increasingly poor economic environment, the United States is kind of thrashing around the world right now, getting in these endless wars for seemingly very little, purpose and payback for it. So basically, I would say that, if you look at Trump, as I began, right, he's kind of like our Nero, right? So he's fiddling right now as on Twitter as the world burns.
Fiddling with his iPhone.
Fiddling with his iPhone as the world burns. He kind of represents this crisis of liberal democracy, and also, I think, a degradation of the U.S. ruling class's ability to find a reasonable representation of its interest. So I think ultimately, and I want your take on this, the question is, will the United States, in this moment of imperial decline, as I put it, go gently into that good night? Will it wind down its imperial death machine? Will it check the imperatives of infinite growth that are baking the fucking planet right now and threatening all human existence? Or are we going to go down fighting like past empires have when they've gone down? I think that that proposition is very fucking scary right now, because if we go out like the British went out in the Second World War when we took over for them, we don't have another world war in us. The next world war is going to be a nuclear war. And with Trump at the trigger, it's very imperative right now that we all start to organize, agitate, educate, and fight.
Right. So right off the bat, I want to invoke a little Antonio Gramsci, who's one of my most, influential theorists I've read. But he once mused that the old world is dying, the new one struggles to be born, and during this interregnum, a variety of morbid symptoms appear. And you, I think, hit on some of those morbid symptoms, this death drive towards capital accumulation, and a more, smaller scale thing, something like Trump arising and getting elected against all odds and all preconceived notions of how politics works, and this imperial core. But I think, unfortunately, that the United States is going to, if it does go down with a fight. I don't think the ruling class is going to surrender its power willingly at all.
I hate to say it, but I agree with you on that one.
And you bring up the notion of hegemony. And again, to invoke Gramsci, he has a notion of cultural hegemony. And what makes this situation so harrowing is that even ostensible radicals or those who are trying to resist the United States imperialist machine inherently adopt some of the trappings of the empire itself. We can't even conceive of a world beyond our current existence. Another classic phrase, it's easier to conceive the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism.
Suddenly, Posadism doesn't seem so crazy.
Right. Now, that being said, I don't think it's instructive or helpful to view the coming capitalist crisis as a sort of teleology where, it's inevitably going to trend towards a collapse and then we need to see. No, I think nothing is written. But given the existing circumstances, given the military presence in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and all over the world, this empire is hyperextended. And it is a house of cards in a way. And we ourselves on the left, I think, are going to have a chance, whether it's in a few years or 10 years, to seize that opportunity and try to stake out a counter-hegemony, if you will. So while we don't want to adopt the trappings of the ruling class, we need to recognize what their tactics and strategies are and kind of reformulate them for our own purposes.
I agree 100%, and this is why I think the two, as we've been talking about, have to be intertwined, right? If you are anti-war, you have to be anti-capitalism, because the two things are basically so determined, amongst themselves that you can't get rid of one without the other. As I said before, we have this dying empire on a dying planet, as you talked about. The socialist left, the anti-capitalist left, has to try to featherbed this, as we say in the union movement, right? Mm-hmm. Which is like, if you're going down, let's go down gently, right? And we can't do that by simply attacking the military-industrial complex alone, although that is part of it, right? We need to attack both tips of this spear, or both poles of this domination and imperialism. And as the famous philosopher Walter White once said, no half measures, all right? Mm-hmm. No half measures. You can't have one without the other.
I would also like to pick at a little bit the sort of liberal anti-war idea that the best way to change things is through bourgeois democracy and electing the right people, right? Because we have seen some moves out of the left wing of the Democratic Party lately to lay out a better vision of foreign policy than the one we have seen so far from the Democratic establishment, and even make some connections between our bloated military funding and widespread austerity. And I think a lot of people are looking at that as the best, most quote unquote realistic option for winding down the military industrial complex and U.S. empire. I don't know, what do you think about all that?
Well, I think you're right in saying that there's this particularly liberal impulse to adopt anti-war rhetoric almost as an ideology in and of itself, that if we end the wars and we focus on ourselves domestically, that everything will be all right. But of course, all of the creature comforts that we know, especially in the United States, but the West in general, comes from the extraction of natural resources in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. So I think that a lot of those liberals have their hearts in the right place, but it's a question of political education in more ways than one. And we got to find a way to speak to the larger systemic features of war and why these wars are endless, because they're designed to be that way. They're exceptionally profitable for various arms dealers and contracting companies. And we need to also look at the figures in those countries we're occupying who we co-opt and collaborate with. And through that, I think you could get at a better idea of what anti-imperialism actually constitutes, joined up with a countering vision of the world in terms of like what a socialist program would look like.
Totally. I think this is something that even some leftists still have trouble getting their minds around.
Yeah,
like,
I would agree.
I would really like to see more of an internationalist perspective in the DSA, for instance. I think a lot of people have it, but it still has not quite crystallized in the institutional way that I think it needs to. I think a lot of the time, international issues like Israel-Palestine are treated as sort of a second-order thing, when in fact they are inextricably linked from our socialist project.
Yeah, like you were saying, it's not just that the liberals lack a good analysis. I think, as you said, oftentimes people on the hard left, the far left, whatever you want to call it, the anarchist or the Marxist left, take up some pretty poor and, badly thought out positions on this. This third worldist idea that exists out there, it really is, it seems like the anti-imperialism of fools. There are people out there that argue that the working class in the core countries, which would be all of us sitting in this room right there, right, are actually ourselves exploiting the subaltern folks in the underdeveloped world, the third world, whatever you want to call it, and that we're actually the aristocrats of labor and that we're irredeemably reactionary. And in fact, some argue that we are part of the bourgeoisie itself, right? So, like, because we get these imperialist crumbs, right? There's, like, no way that we can be organized. It has to be, the Naxalites somewhere in India, these Maoist rebels, or Tibet or something like that, right? I think this... Actually, why don't I stop there? Do you want to address that?
Yeah, well, I think in every sense, it's a form of political impotence in a way. And it's a way for you in the West to kind of throw your hands up in the air and say, oh, well, we're part of the problem. I don't have to do anything. I could just sit here and say how bad we are. And that, in the mind of, whoever follows that political line becomes a form of political praxis, but it does nothing. And I want to say, from my perspective and others I've talked to, it's actually quite Orientalist in a way, because you fetishize the struggles of people in places like Syria and places like India. And those people who are engaged in protracted struggles for, decades in some cases at this point, they're not looking for us to do this whole self-referential, oh, we're so guilty. No, we need to organize our own movements, and that's how we show internationalist solidarity.
Dead ass. And And you talked about the people that are struggling in these places right here. So often, how many fucking times do you hear critical support for Assad, support for Gaddafi, critical support for Saddam Hussein, or fucking Putin, or fucking China, right? We, as internationalists and as anti-capitalists, we do not stand with other fucking nation-state leaders. We stand with the working classes of those countries, right? This conception that the enemy of the enemy and the United States government is our enemy, right? Is our friend, is completely fucking bankrupt. And I think you're 100% correct that what this turns into ultimately is some sort of like performative fucking bullshit. What does it mean to critically support Assad? Are you going over there? Are you like fucking fighting with like the Syrian Ba'athist Party?
Some of them do, though.
Yeah, well, fuck them. If you do that, go ahead. Then at least you're fucking critically supporting instead of sitting on a fucking computer with your Twitter account with a fucking Juche avatar, fucking calling, oh, these fucking running dogs of imperialism, stand Assad, fucking destroy U.S. empire. It's complete fucking bullshit. And it's performative. And to borrow a term from the alt-right, it is fucking virtue signaling. Because exactly as you said, it's the politics of impotence. It says that I can sit here and do nothing practically in the core imperialist power where change has to happen, and I can just fucking sit here and I can fucking berate other people for not having the right line on this, while doing nothing material to organize in their community, in their workplace, to fight against war, to fight against imperialism at home, and it fucking makes me sick, to be honest. I'm fucking angry.
And part of the way you know that it's bullshit is that you can look at all the Marxist-Leninist groups, and they all have radically different. They're on every side of the Syrian civil war.
Seriously.
Yeah.
There's a blog. I forgot what it's called, but if you search like left positions on the Syrian civil war, they list like 15, 20 different groups, and they all have different takes. Like each Trotskyist group is on a different side. There's literally Trotskyists fighting Trotskyists.
Seriously.
In the Syrian civil war.
Online. And there's like an 80-year fucking history, especially with Trotskyists. I'm sorry, our Trotskyist friends out there, right? But like, how many of these, Fourth International times 1,000 have broken apart over some correct line, over some anti-imperialist struggle around the globe? Like, I get it. People want to get involved. They want to have the right line on something, right? But like, we got to be way fucking past that at this point in time, right?
Certainly.
We can't be fucking standing, even China, all right? Marxist-Leninists out there, tankies out there, if you have any complaints, don't email us right now. Just go on some fucking subreddit and like shitpost about us. That's all you do anyway. It's totally fucking fine. But people are trying to hold up China as like an anti-imperialist hegemon. All the capital going into Africa right now, the financial debt that those countries are in, the fucking exploitation by Chinese capital, they're paving half of fucking Africa right now.
Yeah.
And you're gonna and they're setting up fucking bombing bases in the middle of the South China Sea. And you're gonna say that fucking China is a progressive power and not imperialist? Like, go fuck yourself.
Right. And I want to add, it's complicated just because, you might have critiques of a leader or a political group in another country does not mean you support U.S. intervention.
Exactly.
You could be against both of them. And
Exactly.
I got to tell you, there's nothing that the U.S. military loves more than the left completely dividing itself and relinquishing any stake in the struggle, both here and abroad. And that's what happens when you have these completely ahistorical and divorced from any actual knowledge of those countries. When you have this position of, I'm not going to do anything. So I also want to hit on the fact that I'm glad you brought up the situation of Africa, for all intents and purposes, being colonized, because, again, I said earlier it's Orientalist to fetishize a lot of these moves, but there's a sense of racism there, and also of American exceptionalism and a U.S.-centric perspective, because every reference to the struggles abroad concerns the role of the U.S. in those affairs, and it doesn't start with the people of those countries or the government of that country. It starts with the United States role in being an arbiter there, and I think that is precisely the problem. And if you kind of strip away the U.S.-centric perspective, then we can have an adequate debate on what it means to support our comrades around the world.
Thank you, and that comes exactly like as we've been talking about from a structural critique. And just one more fucking thing on this, because I don't want to be picking on Maoists, I don't want to be picking on Trotskyists, I don't want to be picking on anybody. I'll add the anarchists in here too, because Noam Chomsky, who was my gateway drug into all this shit, right?
Same.
Does much of the same thing. You know, the U.S. is like the evil power in the world, and everything that we do to destroy other people, and that we're the worst in the world.
Yeah,
we are, but that's like it's not enough. It's not enough.
That sounds
so anarchists too. You're on the hook.
That sounds like a pretty idealist conception of the problem, like the U.S. is just evil or whatever, when we should be looking at the material explanation.
I mean, I straw man
always.
Chomsky a little bit, but yeah, like,
the materialist critique is kind of lacking in saying this
Yeah.
person's evil or this group is evil.
Indeed.
Yeah, that's not the Antifada mindset. So the Russia stuff is obviously fucking ridiculous, right? And some leftists might be doing it as a reaction to dumb liberals who are like, Putin subverted our democracy and gave the election to Trump. And then the equally stupid reaction, which is like, Yas, Queen, we stand with Comrade Putin against U.S. imperialism, giving us a taste of our own medicine,
right.
fucking with our elections as if two wrongs could ever make a right. But even in cases where the people who American tankies are standing with are more sympathetic, could still be problematic, right? Like we were talking about what's happening in Syria, and a lot of American leftists have a lot of investment in Rojava and in Kurdish nationalism, which is sort of tied to that. And I will admit to being very sympathetic and interested in what's happening in Rojava, but I still don't support Kurdish nationalism because nationalism is bad regardless. The Palestinian people, who are not oppressing anyone at the moment, right? There's no argument that could be made for that. A lot of Palestinian nationalism is a reaction to oppression, right? To Israeli oppression, to settler colonialism. And yet, and it's obviously better than the nationalism of the conquerors, but I still am not really comfortable
Standing
with
Hamas.
I'm still not really comfortable with, well, yes, that too, but even the idea of a Palestinian nation state as the solution to the oppression that's going on there, right? People talk about the two-state solution or the one-state solution. Like, we want the fucking no-state solution.
Right.
Hell yeah.
I will say that I understand that national liberation is far different from nationalism as we know it, for example, in the United States. And the question of the two-state versus one-state solution, as many Palestinian activists will say, the two-state solution does not exist. It's not a reality. And the only way for us to even begin to take the steps of Palestinian liberation is for the one-state solution. Of course, as Norman Finkelstein would say, as a classic communist, I support a no-state solution. But as it stands now, I do recognize and I do agree that a one-state solution for the Palestinian peoples is the only way for them to have any semblance of rights and material dignity in their country.
Certainly in the short term, that's something that I also support. I don't want anyone to get it twisted. But if the end product, if the horizon is a state that is ruled by a Palestinian ruling class, that's not going to be enough.
Exactly. Yeah. 100%. And I think that again comes down to politics, and it comes down to vision, and it comes down to short, medium, and long term. Because I'm sympathetic with the left composition of anti-nationalism in general, and obviously it's an anarchist thing as well, right? But of course, that has to be moderated IRL, because people are suffering in the real world. National liberation. I could go on a spiel about how I think at a point in time it was progressive in the Marxist sense, but I think now you have empirical evidence across the entire world with the anti-colonial struggle that it has taken a foreign ruling class and replaced it with an indigenous one.
Certainly.
That said, it's really tough to sit here in New York City and talk shit on Palestinians fighting for the freedom. So there's a way to square that circle, I think.
Yeah. Exactly. And I understand why people might be sensitive about it, especially when people, I don't know, I'm not going to name any names, but folks with specific online shitposty agenda might go a little too far out of the way talking shit on the Palestinian nation question.
Oh, I don't know who you're referring to. We'll put that in the show notes, I guess. You're getting called out in our fucking show notes.
That was... So we know what we cannot achieve, right? By being armchair third worldists sitting here in the U.S. and supporting enemies of U.S. imperialism in ways that don't make any sense. But what can we do? And I'm really interested in getting your take on this, Spenser, because I know you've talked a lot about direct action within the Army rank and file and the potential for mutinies and insubordination.
Yeah, so I think that any form of resistance within the ranks, and we could start with this as a case study, today, given the existing material conditions, it's going to happen on the molecular level. And Sean earlier mentioned the molecular features of capitalism. Well, if you want to actually achieve some foothold and getting soldiers out of the military or causing them to refuse orders, it's going to start on a level where soldiers amongst themselves kind of talk, kind of have their own smaller organizing committees. I had something of the sort when I was in with a group of people, both when I was a cadet and as an officer. And we all kept in touch with each other, and we all had our own systemic critiques. We would do reading groups. It started with a form of political education. We'd read different Marxist theories and stuff of that nature. I myself, being a rather, I guess, provocative figure in comparison to them, and given my
way.
Yeah, and given my direct experience with the war in Afghanistan, I found an opening where an individual act of rebellion and resistance might move the needle a little bit. And in the history of soldiers resisting, for example, in Vietnam, it didn't just start out with a mass movement. Individual acts of resistance are historically important and valuable. And once you have 1, 2, and then 3 people, pick up that task, it starts to influence others. And then from there, you kind of normalize the idea of it's a possibility to resist the army. It's a possibility to refuse to deploy. And we came close to that in the mid-2000s, but then the Obama election kind of subsumed a lot of the anti-war efforts into the liberal mindset that we discussed previously. But I do think that right now we are seeing the cracks starting to form in the foundation of the capitalist military enterprise. There's my friend and classmate Matt Malcolm, who recently got out as a conscientious objector. There's Captain Brittany DeBarros, who's currently was on active duty as a reservist. She got called up, but she's most of the time a reservist, but she's currently engaged in a struggle with the United States Army and fighting a battle for her, just speaking out against the military-industrial complex and tweeting out facts about the number of deaths, the number of people bombed every day. And you could see how terrified the military gets when, a person, one of their personnel just says the most lighthearted of critiques of just pointing out facts that the military itself posts. So in terms of the actual direct action and tangible efforts, right now we're not at the, stage, I suppose, where we're all going to grab our rifles and storm the barricades. Maybe down the line, but right now, those individual acts of rebellion could lead to a larger mass movement that gives people the courage to resist. And from there, we could channel it into a larger socialist movement.
You said, so before we get into some more historical incidences of mutinies in the Army, you said that you saw some cracks right now in the culture of the Army and the armed forces. And I was thinking, I remember leading up to the election, hearing a lot of troops say that, well, they might not like Trump, but at least he was against going to war in Syria, against expanding these insane wars. Like, he talked about pulling out of Afghanistan. He pretended that he was to the left of Clinton on Iraq. But now we've seen that that's not the case.
Right.
Do you think that there's a lot of people like you in the Army, if not reading Marx or reading interested in anti-imperialist ideas, just generally wanting there to be a change in the system that keeps us in these endless, pointless wars that nobody believes in?
I do. I would say that 99% of the people in the military do not like being in the military. You're taken away from your home, from your family, from your support network, and your life is just miserable. Now, in terms of the political consciousness, that's a different question, but there is a sizable minority of military personnel sympathetic to our politics. Although I received a number of death threats and, from, like Trump, MAGA Warrior 1776 online, I got a lot of emails and a lot of outreach from active duty personnel who are grappling with the question in their own way. So from my own direct experience, I know it's out there. The problem is and this is a question we ourselves on the left have to answer, is how do we establish that counter-hegemony and build up the counter-infrastructure and support networks? So if people do want to leave the military and do want to get out, how do we bring them into the fold then and allow them to become a part of our movement? Of course, we don't want to center them, but letting them know that we're with them, we understand, and they have a vital role to play in this larger movement we're trying to create.
So that reminds me of something we were talking about a few episodes ago, which is how do you get someone to make the jump from hating their boss and hating their job to having a systemic critique of capitalism? Because it's not necessarily a given, and it's not something that's always going to happen, when you just leave a bunch of individuals, atomized individuals, to their own devices. Like, maybe you could talk about how you made the jump, or like how do we get people there from one place to another?
Sure. Well, in many ways, it's almost too soon to say, because I'm still in that moment myself. What I'm trying to do is set an example that, of course, whenever you engage in any type of civil disobedience or resistance, you're going to take a hit. There is going to be something, if you're challenging power effectively, where you might lose, a stake in a career or some, whatever, benefits, as we discussed earlier. But you're going to take a hit. But in that process of losing something, you gain something more. And whether it's dignity for yourself or being part of something where you actually are serving the people, that's the wager. And it's kind of, it's a question I've been grappling with too. And given that I'm really only 2 months removed, it remains to be seen how effective my action was and, everyone around me. But I do think getting people to make that jump is possible because of the historical content of resistors in this country's history and countries around the world.
Yeah, that the historical aspect is something we like to do here on the Antifada, so I'm glad you brought it up. I think the context, maybe, to put your experience in, and I hope you agree with me on this, is that we are in a cycle of struggles right now. There's a term, it's not really that jargony, right? But it essentially says that there are moments when people are atomized, there's moments when mass movements don't exist, but these pressures sort of build up, and there's these cycles where people come together, they create mass movements that connect all these different struggles together, the struggles against imperialism, against poverty, against capitalism itself, right? And then eventually, this reaches this high tide, and then it kind of drifts away, and then we return to this cycle at a later date. So we're 10 years from the fiscal crisis, as people remember, that crisis of capitalism. The last high tide that we had was, I think I'd say in the early 1970s, our favorite decade on the Antifada.
Hell yeah.
So, it makes some sense, I think, to go back and look at some concrete examples of exactly the kind of work that you're doing and how that has gone from these sort of individual acts and, small cadre of folks trying to reach out and turn into a mass movement. Because if we saw anything, the Vietnam War and something like the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, it was these individual grievances turning into structural critique, turning into mass movements, and actually changing the course of history.
Yeah. So for me personally, one of the moments I took inspiration from was Andy Stapp's efforts in the 70s to unionize the army during the Vietnam era. And Stapp is an interesting figure because he actually was a college student who had burnt his draft card. But after being involved in the anti-war movement for some time, he ultimately decided that salting the army, in a sense, was the way to go. And so he voluntarily enlisted, ended up at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and from there did his part in trying to radicalize troops on the inside.
And by salting here, you do not mean enjoying the tears of your enemies, but in the more traditional formation, joining or getting a job somewhere in order to unionize it.
Yes. And I think why Stapp as a case study is so important is, much like there's this mythology that Vietnam veterans coming back got spat upon, there's also this conception, and it exists on the left too, that the only reason there was any resistance was because of a draft. And in fact, while that's an element of it, a great number of the war resistors themselves were volunteers. And I think it's important for us to grapple with the question of how disillusionment plays a vital role in radicalization and creating a consensus of radicals in the military.
Hell yeah. I think Andy actually has a really awesome clip from a John Pilger news broadcast from 1970 called The Quiet Mutiny. It's about exactly what we're talking about here in Vietnam.
About the same next week, and the next, and the next, until the very last American division, combat division, is withdrawn. And so far, for all the words from Washington, only paper soldiers have gone home. The war isn't over, but it is ending. It is ending not because of the Paris talks or the demonstrations at home. It is ending because the largest and wealthiest and most powerful organization on earth, the American Army, is being challenged from within, from the very cellars of its pyramid, from the most forgotten, the most brutalized, and certainly the bravest of its members. The war is ending because the grunt is taking no more bullshit.
I just don't like, I just can't take too much pressure from the Army. You know?
What happens to an unpopular officer out in the field?
Mostly unpopular officers, from what I heard, if they mess with a grunt too much, they get shot out there.
A friend of mine, captain, kind of got shot in the back.
What was he doing? What was the captain doing to deserve being shot in the back?
From what my friend said, he was telling them just go on through, and well, they were getting hit pretty bad, and he was telling them just keep on going. They said no. He kind of got shot.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of mistakes, but you know the grunts don't always do what the captain says. You know, we got the captain will stay back. He'll tell a platoon or something to go out so many 100 meters. You know, we don't do it. We only go as far as we get out of sight, sit down, and come back in. We don't want to hit contact. That's one thing we don't want to hit.
So I think that's not only Pilger's editorial there, but that's also actual troops in Vietnam. We don't know whether they're volunteers or whether they were conscripted, talking about this phenomenon that already in 1970, so 5 years before Saigon falls, have been talking, have been organizing around insubordination and sometimes more violent acts. And just to show folks before we kind of get back to the Vietnam thing, that this isn't just John Pilger, who's a famous leftist journalist, right? I have a quote here from an article published in the Armed Forces Journal from 1971. This is a Marine colonel, a combat veteran. This Marine colonel says, quote, "By every conceivable indicator, our army that remains in Vietnam is in a state of approaching collapse, with individual units avoiding or having refused combat, murdering their officers, and non-commissioned officers. Sedition, coupled with disaffection from within the ranks and externally fomented with an audacity and intensity previously inconceivable, infests the armed forces." So that's straight from the Army brass right there. It was a real phenomenon, and I think it's instructive for us today when we think about maybe the failures of 2003 to stop the war and the kind of efforts that Spenser here is calling for.
Yeah, and bringing it back then to Stapp, well, I think his contributions to the anti-war movement were so significant is, when we talked about the question of atomization, and even in the anti-war movement in its early stages, you have different, soldiers, Marines, what have you, who had their own subjective experiences of disillusionment or discontent. And Stapp, in terms of what we were discussing earlier, tried to take that energy and channel it into an actual strategic position of unionizing the Army directly. And I'll say, part of my investigation on me in the packet, one of the charges brought against me was that I had advocated for military labor unions. And it's in U.S. code right now. It's explicitly illegal to advocate for them because of this guy in his 20s who, just by talking with soldiers throughout the barracks, at training events, like I said, on the molecular level, he got them on board with the attempts at unionizing soldiers. And from there, it absolutely terrified the brass, and they had to put it into law to make sure that this would never be attempted again.
That's incredible. And I think that one of the subversive, he's talking about these people were fermented disaffection from the outside, right? This is something I think that the history is very, very poorly presented to us, when we're kids or when we're watching the History Channel or whatever it is, that it's just these, middle-class college students at Kent State or wherever who are protesting, they're marching on the Pentagon or whatever the case may be. There were real grassroots efforts from not just college students and young socialists and older socialists, but also veterans, who had returned from Vietnam to open up things like informational coffee shops, right? To reach the active rank and file grunt and to try to make this molecular discontent into something bigger. So there really were subversive forces on the outside, and we liked them. They did really good work.
And it's important to note, at that time, of course, the civil rights struggle was a very living memory for many people. So, for the black experience in the military, you see a lot of the same, of course, structural racism present in society within the ranks. And so, groups like the Black Panthers were very serious about reaching out to black veterans and helping them name their experiences and take that discontent and turning it into a larger social movement.
Yeah, and a lot of women were radicalized through this as well. Like we talked a few episodes ago about the National Welfare Rights Organization, which was women, mostly black women, who were explicitly making the connection between their reproductive labor for society, raising the next generation of workers or soldiers or whatever, and their sons being sent to die overseas. And they wanted to claim, hey, this is labor in service of capital. We deserve something in return.
Hell yeah. That's what, that's why in the beginning I put this this conception of the cycle of struggles there, because, the Vietnam experience, we can call it, not only at home but obviously also abroad, happens in a kind of historical conjunction of all these, like you say, the Black Panthers. We're also talking about the growth of the SDS.
Yeah.
We're talking about, mass socialist organizing across the country, mass wildcat strikes. It was a real moment when, again, there was this connection of not just soldier to soldier or worker to worker or connecting their struggles together, right? It was this sort of movement of movements, as we called it in the 1990s, that all together created this kind of ferment within the cycle of struggle that really reached its peak. In some senses, its expression in this anti-war, anti-Vietnam movement. Yeah.
In addition to all this popular resistance we saw to the Vietnam War, there was another citizen resistance effort around the same time. And, the popular resistance to Vietnam had some very real victories, right? It basically ended the war. But this other resistance effort went even farther than that. And I'm talking, of course, about the Carnation Revolution in Portugal.
Yeah, so the Carnation Revolution was vitally important to my own radicalization as well, because it was led by a group of young captains, junior officers. And similarly to America being involved in a seemingly endless war abroad, at the time, Portugal was heavily entrenched in Mozambique, Angola, and at the time what was known as Portuguese Guinea.
You are an Italian American, so you're allowed to use that slur, but go on.
Yeah, right, folks. But anyway, yeah. So that was good. That was really good.
Thanks.
Yeah. Goddamn.
It's okay. Take your time. I derailed you, my bad.
That was good. I like it. Yeah, keeping me honest. Yeah.
We do comedy sometimes.
Yeah, of course. We have a lot of anti-Italian rhetoric here going on.
Well, you're our first Italian American guest.
Oh, really?
That's not
big.
just our
Is that
first
so?
troop, but also our first Italian.
I've been writing a Medium post about the harassment I received at the Antifada.
Anti-Italian American sentiment.
It's going to post while we're still recording.
Yeah,
It's going to be really awkward.
Yeah, Spectre is among us. Yeah. But anyhow, so
of all the other slurs we have, we're now anti-Italian.
Right.
Sorry, go on.
We're equal opportunity offenders.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh god. All right. No more slurs. Go on.
Yeah. All right. So these group of junior officers, they formed what was known as the Armed Forces Movement, and their chief demand was the end of the Portuguese colonial project. And again, we talked about organizing at the molecular level. So the young officers spearheaded this movement, but they also had ties with some of the NCOs and other recruits.
That's non-commissioned officers, right?
Yes, correct. And what was so compelling about the Carnation Revolution is that it essentially occurred without a shot being fired by the revolutionary forces.
That's so good.
Yeah.
That's good as hell. Because
that's the future the left wants.
I really want to use this segment to debunk the idea that leftist revolutions always have to be bloody and violent and horrible.
Right. And that's important because I don't think any of us here are pacifists, but, you know, there's a tendency among a certain or a certain group on the left to fetishize the idea of violence, and that's a very dangerous path to go down.
Agreed.
And in many ways, you adopt the militarism inherent in this society and in the United States Armed Forces itself. But yeah, the revolution goes off without a single shot being fired, and the people themselves, in an interesting act of spontaneity, they were instructed by the revolutionary leaders to kind of stay home, you know, because it might get violent, it might get dangerous. But the masses actually disobeyed that and joined all of the soldiers in the street as they were, you know, refusing orders. They were occupying street corners, the roads themselves. And what happens then is that you have a group of radical junior officers. Then you have a couple generals who are kind of middle of the road, centrist, social democracy types. And after the fascist regime is overthrown, you see this internal struggle happening, which again is another lesson learned, wherein Portuguese becomes an ostensible democracy of sorts, but some of the more radical elements get lost in the shuffle. But much like Vietnam, you have the actual goal of ending the war abroad, being successful, and then the social effects that happen afterwards, you know, it remains to be determined where that goes. And again, for us right now, we need to be very conscious of that. But I just want to emphasize the Carnation Revolution as an example of a directly anti-imperialist struggle that was accomplished not by, you know, shooting generals, which, you know, is good practice in and of itself, but by work stoppages, by striking, by occupations, which to this day, of course, the general strike is the greatest weapon in the hands of the working class.
And one would say the rank and file military, right? Because I think that one huge aspect of this and why it's really interesting is that it was essentially, as they say, as you guys said, nonviolent. The reason it's called the Carnation Revolution, right, is because it happens on April 25th,
yes,
which was Carnation season
yes,
in Portugal, and so they put flowers in the guns and the barrels of the tanks, right? And that was part of the celebration of the entire thing.
And they were red, so, you know, of course, in solidarity with the socialist and communist content of
our favorite color.
Indeed.
Our favorite color.
So I was going to ask you, what was different about this revolution versus the Vietnam War resistance that turned it into a successful uprising against not just the imperial war machine, not just those particular wars, but the fascist state at large? And I think you just touched on one of them, which was the relationship between the army and the general population, right? Because, I mean, it's possible that I've gotten the wrong idea from movies and TV, but it seems to me like the troops had a lot of trouble reintegrating into society when they came back from Vietnam, and some of the treatment on the part of these like campus student activists wasn't the best towards the veterans of the war. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, that's a larger historical question, because in Portugal, you actually have more of a long-standing communist movement. They had an actual communist party. So unlike the U.S., where we have decades of anti-communist propaganda from the first Red Scare, then into the second Red Scare, in Portugal, communism and socialism were valid political perspectives. So even if you were in the military, you have many officers and lower-ranking soldiers alike who were exposed to those political conceptions. And so then if you encounter those ideas and you yourself are taking part in colonialist violence, such as in, you know, Mozambique, Angola, and Portuguese Guinea, you start to find a way to resolve those contradictions, which is what led to these soldiers forming these different enclaves of resistance pockets.
And I would add to that, too, knowing a bit about the history, is that, you know, there's a real blowback always when we go abroad. I think we're going to touch on this in a little bit. A lot of the blowback from Afghanistan and Iraq and these wars, the war on terror, as they call it in general, is PTSD, veterans who are not getting the help they need, opiate addiction, poverty, and just horrendous treatment of the people that went over there, got maimed or not. You know, but the blowback, you know, from Vietnam is really real. You know, there was a moment in time politically in this country, they called it Vietnam syndrome, right? Where all of a sudden the United States kind of lost its, I don't know, mental footing as an imperialist power. You know, what's different, I think, perhaps about Portugal, and you put your finger on it, is that the fight against imperialism could be combined with a real fight for this abstraction of democracy. Because if people don't know the history, I won't go too much into it, of the Estado Novo, it was a Francoist, integralist, Catholic, essentially fascist military dictatorship. So, you know, alongside this anti-imperialist fight, there was this real sense that Portugal as a state was backwards in the 1970s as a fascist state, you know, as Spain was under Franco next to it, right? And that, like, it was possible to unite this anti-war stuff with, you know, this kind of struggle against this antiquated military dictatorship, right, that existed at that time.
And I should say, there was a communist movement in the U.S. at this point, but it was weak. It was completely severed from the working class as a whole, or largely so. I mean, we see that with the history of SDS and how they veered off in some really unproductive directions. And
yeah, all those bombings really helped Weather Underground. Well done, you bourgeois rich kid motherfucking piece of shit.
Yeah.
Leftist fucking scum.
I was trying to be nice about it, but yes,
can't be
that
nice,
is
fuck those rich kids.
yeah, fuck them.
Rich kids, stay the fuck out. Just go home.
But like, yeah,
unless you want to give us your money, if you're good class
that's
traders,
acceptable.
we'll
Yeah,
take your
we'll
money.
take that.
Give us revolutionary trust funds.
oh,
That's your job.
absolutely. That's your $100 a month Patreon tier. You get to be a comrade of the revolution, and we will no longer dump on you for being a rich kid.
We will call it the Engels tier.
Exactly, exactly. But it seems to me like the communist movement in Portugal at this time was much more organized, much more politically coherent, and much more connected to the working class, which, as we all know, is a pretty foundational element if we want communism to win.
Right. And Portuguese communists at the time were not looking at past movements as an algorithm in which they plug in their people and their party. They examine their existing material conditions and they work from there, which is, for us, what we need to do. We can't just adopt, point by point what the Portuguese communists were doing at the time. We need to formulate our own movement relevant to the material conditions today.
Exactly. That might sound radical. That might sound crazy. It's a lot easier to take a book, say, written about the highest stage of imperialism 100 years ago and try to graft that onto our conditions today. But it is actually the orthodox Marxist position and probably the right, way to take things, to actually look at the, real movement that abolishes the present state of things instead of going back to some, great leader from, the communist past. Like the people in Portugal did at that time. Like, we need to have a strong critical analysis of things happening and not just plug in some bullshit from the past, but learn from history at the same time.
So were some of these troops radicalized in the course of their service, or were they more radical going into the experience?
No, well, I mean, again, a lot of them had exposure to communist and socialist ideas, but a good number of them took part in the occupation of Mozambique, Angola, and so on. They had direct confrontations even with some resistance forces in those countries. But much like in Vietnam, how a number of soldiers began to identify more with Vietnamese forces, the Viet Cong and so on, so too in Portugal did a lot of these younger soldiers start to identify with the resistance movements abroad. And things like not getting paid an adequate wage for their service and things like that played another part as well.
So in the course of this imperialist war, as conscripts or as volunteers, these Portuguese rank and file or NCO or junior officers, encountered these resistance fighters as human beings, something that happened in Vietnam as well, as you said. And I think from the story that you recounted on Eyes Left podcast, folks, everyone listen to it, that was something that you started to see as well, right? Is starting to see the Iraqis not as they were often called, I'm sure, as Hajis, but instead as actual human beings that you were I don't know, billeted to go in and harass and potentially kill. So this, I think, brings us to a larger question, right? About, there's your personal story, and I think it is personally a heroic and a beautiful, wonderful story. At least as of right now, you could just go off and I don't know, start selling like communism will win T-shirts and become like bourgeois scum. But I think it's a very inspiring story. So let's kind of look at the factors that push and pull against the potential that we could be seeing in this cycle of struggles, a kind of new movement of resistance against the forces of capitalism and imperialism.
Yeah, this is something you talked about a lot in your talk at the Socialism Conference that I thought was very interesting, because we maybe as outsiders might view the army, the military, as this sort of impenetrable wall of indoctrination and conservatism. I know there's a lot of racism floating around.
Not to mention, when you and your homeboy were talking on episode 1, you guys have your own jargon.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, that's almost impenetrable, too, like anything.
Certainly.
Yeah. But I was really inspired by the way you spoke about the potential for class consciousness within the military, especially considering that our quote-unquote all-volunteer army is driven by economically coercive factors and austerity to the point where it's basically an economic draft.
Yeah, you're right in the sense that the military is quite impenetrable. It is tough to express in words, just the drudgery and the alienation you feel as a soldier on any given day due to the indoctrination, due to what you actually have to do in your job. But within that horror, you're right. There is a chance for some larger movement of raising the class consciousness of the troops. And primarily, it is going to be the economic coercion that led them to joining the military in the first place. I'm from Newcastle, Pennsylvania, which is like a classic Rust Belt city that's just been completely ripped to shreds over the last 40 years. And recruiters were ever prevalent in my school and in my community. And they especially would target, people of color because of, the economic factors they face. And what's interesting, and again, another one of the contradictions of the military is I've never been in a school or any type of work environment that was as diverse as the military. In my basic training class alone, we had people from many different walks of life, with our one common factor being the majority of us were working class.
Right. I was going to say that diversity reflects the diversity of the U.S. working class, right?
Yes.
Because that's the recruits, essentially.
Right. And so in many ways, the military is almost like a microcosm of American society at large. So there is great potential there for organizing troops. The problem is that there has been such an effort by military, high-ranking military officers and politicians to strip the military of its political content and role. Thomas Sankara once said that, in so many words, that one of the most dangerous things you can have is a soldier who thinks they're apolitical, and that's a potential criminal. And that's true because in the Army, from day one, you're told it's not your place to question orders or to wonder about the larger strategic implications. You execute your task, you shoot, move, and communicate. So a lot of, people in the military, they're not really interested in saying they are, a Republican or a Democrat. They're mostly interested in kind of this, what they think is a centrist position of saying, fuck the politicians, I'm just trying to do my job. But when you really start to peel back those layers, you recognize that your job is supporting a particular class of people, and it is supporting the interests of a class that you have nothing in common with, and that doesn't view you as human in any sense.
And that kind of matches with what is essentially a class hierarchy within the military, right? So you've got your grunts, which are like the proles, and then you've got middle management, and then of course you have like a ruling caste above that kind of sets the orders for everybody.
Right. And then even within your own different billets, whether you're combat arms or you're in a support position, or if you're in like, the so-called elite units, like I was with the Rangers. So it's another interesting contradiction. I was taught, as a young soldier, as a young Ranger, to view the rest of the Army, the big Army, as they called it, with contempt. You don't want to fail out of the Ranger Assessment and Selection Program because then you'll end up as a bullet stopper in the big Army.
God.
Wow. That's like a microcosm, too, of, I think, a lot of the anxiety that working class and quote-unquote middle class professionals, feel nowadays of, like, not wanting to fall down into that lower stratum that you are trained to have contempt for.
Right. And that's how you make yourself, kind of feel better with what you're doing. You're like, well, this sucks. I hate my life, but at least I'm not, like, in that unit, or I'm not with those guys.
So very similar to how racism works in the United States in this class system as well.
Wow. So many analogies.
We love analogies.
So, it's all connected, man. So on the topic of the things people do and the ways people cope with the situation they're in when they're in the military, I think on the one hand, it could have a radicalizing effect on you. You just realize the whole thing's really fucked up. On the other hand, it could have a radicalizing effect in the other direction, right? It could make you very conservative, even reactionary, because if you are out there killing people, right, something instinctively is wrong, like a very common strategy on the part of the army is to dehumanize them and make it seem like it's kind of okay. And that leads into all kinds of other reactionary politics and jingoistic attitudes that are reinforced by that. And I think Sean has a story he would like to tell about a friend of his who unfortunately went in that direction.
Yeah, so I didn't do the best in high school. Kind of fucked off. Went to a lot of punk rock shows, skateboarded. I don't smoke weed anymore, but I may have hit the pipe a couple times. So, when I barely squeaked by, my father told me to go do what he did when he fucked up in high school and go work in a factory. He thought it would scare me enough to go back to school or something like that. So I did, and I went and I got a factory job. I had a great friend who will remain nameless because we do not dox our friends on this show, but we'll call him Richie. He and I were in the same position. He also was working in a factory, and parenthetically, both of the factories we were working in, I was working in an elastomer factory, and he was working in a basically ammunition factory. We both were working for the military-industrial complex at that point in time. About a year or so after that, we were both kind of unhappy with the situation we were in. My story is that I ended up in community college, but one day he came to me, to all his friends, with a pamphlet from a recruiter, the type of person you were talking about, and he said, "I'm going to join the Navy as a corpsman." And we were all like, this is crazy, like we're punks, we were into anarcho-peace punk, we loved Crass Records and shit like that. But, he was in this position where economically, he saw this as his only way forward. And so he goes off to the military, he goes through boot camp, he goes to deployment, and he actually gets deployed in Kosovo in our peacekeeping operation over there. In the course of that, I won't go into all the details, but this really sweet, smart young guy ends up as a corpsman who's basically medical personnel, having to shoot and kill somebody in combat, which is rare, but it happened. So he comes back, and he's on leave for a week, and he comes home, and he comes to our couch, and he stays on our couch for like 4 weeks. And finally we're like, dude, aren't you supposed to go back to the military? And he's like, oh, I'm so fucked up, I don't think I can go back. I didn't go into the military to kill people. I wanted to go to help people. I wanted to get an education. This is my option, and I don't want to do this anymore. Eventually, long story short, is I drove him 36 hours to the base that he was at so that he would just be AWOL and not actually a deserter. And I got him back just in the nick of time, and he went back into the military. So he killed somebody in Kosovo, and it fucked him up. He went to Iraq, and he went to Fallujah when he re-signed. That fucked him up too. And as the time went on, he did not go left. And this might have been product of the times. It might have just been his own, contingent situation, right? But the way that he dealt with this was through this kind of dehumanization that you were talking about. And I love him to death. He's one of my best friends, and there, by the grace of God, go I, because it was an option that I could have taken too. But he's now 18 years in, and he's an E8, about to be an E9, and he's doing great. And he's got a family and a wonderful guy, but he is a super jingoistic Trump supporter. Jamie, feels uncomfortable around him because of his politics sometimes. He's my boy. I love him forever. But he is the perfect example of somebody who still to this day, can hold very, very, very chauvinistic, racist and dehumanizing views, but still listen to like Crass and, Rudimentary Peni and The Clash and all these bands, because the cognitive dissonance has to be solved in some sort of way. And so instead of breaking left like you did, I should say, he broke the other way. And he's now the example of what Jamie was talking about, is kind of fallen into this whole sort of macho, right-wing military culture.
It's interesting. He could have ended up being the guy at the Mike Ness Social Distortion show getting flattened.
He is a huge... I went to see, actually, Social D with him when we lived in the city together some years back. But yeah, he's a big Social D fan. He might have been the guy that got his ass beat. But he could probably fight better than that fat
True,
chud, so,
true.
Yeah. We had some scraps back in the days. But, a skate deck is a great weapon.
That's right.
That's all I got to say. That's all I got to say.
I mean, most of the guys I've
it.
served with were super into various forms of punk or pop punk. You see a lot of, The Offspring, Bad Religion, which I still love.
I should say it's a more common outcome than someone breaking left, because there are so many factors in our culture, like within and outside of the military, right? There's like the pageantry around the troops and sort of the conflation of supporting the troops with supporting U.S. foreign policy. There's a large amount of gun culture in America. There's this sort of blind patriotism. There are all these pro-war propaganda movies, like
You make it sound
American
like it's
Sniper.
You make
whatever.
it sound like it's a conspiracy, like the Army pays the NFL to do jingoistic pageants at halftime.
I would never say such a thing, but
It's in the documents.
And then there's, the role played by traditional notions of masculinity too, like you're only a real man if you are willing to go engage in violence in service of your country, and all of your emotions have to be expressed outwardly as anger and violence. Like, what's your take on all that, and what can we do about it, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mention all of that, because a lot of those phenomena are a result of the post 9/11 era. In culture and film and TV, media in general, prior to 9/11, it wasn't so prevalent, the troop worship we have now. You would find some degree of critique of the military and, to another extent, cops. I just watched this film the other day called Convoy about these truckers, and to see such an explicitly anti-cop film from 19... I was like, you would never see that today. But similarly, with the military, the post-9/11 era really broke everyone's brain and kind of established a civic religion of patriotism. So every film you watch, whether it's a superhero movie or whatever, you're going to have this aspect of the military, the U.S. military being the good guys. But in the framework or the mindset of a young soldier, well, that's ingrained in you. And then when you watch these films, or you talk with other people or see politicians, bloviating about how great you are, it reinforces that mentality. From day one of being a troop, you're taught how to use a rifle, and that rifle is an extension of yourself, and that gives you a rush of sorts, because you now are trained to employ and execute violence on other human beings. You are able to deal out death to another person.
Not only able to, but you're actually licensed to, and
right,
and told
you kill
to.
with impunity,
right.
As a soldier, and so that rifle serving as essentially as a reification of that masculine impulse is very intoxicating, especially for an 18, 19-year-old boy, but even women in the military as well. Because and not only do you have to adopt the masculine persona as a male soldier, but I always say that you really cannot exist as someone who's feminine presenting in the military, because you'll be deemed as someone who's not, embodying the warrior caste, mythology, or persona. And anything feminine is, of course, foreign, and you need to suppress it within yourself, whether you're, a male or a female. So there's that aspect of it too. But in general, I think it does come back to the idea of killing. Whether you are support or whether you are on the front lines as an infantryman, The military's role is to kill other human beings. And when you experience that either indirectly, directly, or somewhere in between, it makes you feel like you have access to a certain power or understanding of the human experience that other people cannot relate to. And from there, that's why you have some people who, even if they see the true nature of combat and war, it's too difficult to break in a way that would cause them to question their own role in that violence. And so you get some people who double down, such as Richie, or plenty of others.
Sure.
And I should say that that sort of toughness or masculinity is... I've seen army recruitment videos directed at women where that's portrayed as a kind of feminism, you know? Or in that, like, fucking shittiest Katy Perry video even that just reads like a propaganda video
Woke
for the
imperialism.
army.
Right.
It's like, yas, queen.
Diversity imperialism.
I'm going to get over my breakup by cutting off my hair like a G.I. Jane and going overseas and killing people. Like, what? Well, and in that sense, it kind of makes sense that she was like all in for Hillary, right? Because Hillary was like the ultimate expression of that.
Absolutely.
It's true.
I also wanted to talk about the things that happen when people come home from the war and try to reintegrate into some sort of normal civilian life, because
such as it is,
I know that it can be really hard for people. I know that people don't get treated the way they should be by the government or by the underfunded VA. And, you know, we've got austerity still as just a general policy in America. People deal with mental health problems. They don't have the framework. They don't have the support to deal with problems like addiction and depression and PTSD. And the whole time, you know, they've been taught that the manly thing to do is just to suppress it. So that's got to play a role as well.
And I would just branch off of what Jamie says. You know, it's hard enough to integrate into, you know, neoliberal capitalist hell world, not facing PTSD and not having the burden of having been part of this imperial death machine. So we can only imagine, you know, what it's like to have that burden, but then also try and live a quote unquote normal life under capitalism.
Yeah. And a big element of that, again, is you experience a certain rush with the high-intensity lifestyle of being in the military, in particular for combat arms folks, but in general, if you've been in the military, there are certain experiences you encounter that are tough to replicate in the civilian life. And so in order to replicate that feeling again, a lot of folks turn to various forms of drugs or alcohol abuse, and the military itself. Alcoholism is an integral part of the culture. And even the manner in which you go out and you drink and you party in the military is very much distinct from how folks do it in the civilian world. So in many cases, you come back from being in the military and you're used to operating in a high-intensity environment where people don't even need to talk to communicate to know where you need to be. And, you know, if you're going on a mission to raid a house or a village or something like that, you deploy for so many months, you come back, and then you rage with your buddies, and you go, you know, execute a training cycle, and you do all these different things. It's
that like a built-in bender sort of thing.
Yeah, in many ways. That's a great way of putting it. But then when you're done with it all and you get out, you start to maybe kind of zoom out a little bit, and you're like, wait, what the fuck was I just doing for the past 2 to 3 years of my life? And because you really don't have an adequate way of expressing the trauma, and you were taught to bury it and suppress it, it manifests itself in other forms of, many times, domestic violence or lashing out on people in public, as we've seen a number of times, or, again, any number of ways. But the military is woefully ill-equipped to deal with veterans who have experienced trauma and finding a way to get them adequate treatment.
I was pretty horrified in the part of the Vietnam documentary that we watched when he talks about the donut bellies, which are like cute girls that they sent over to like play trivia games with the troops. I'm like, oh, that's nice. And then the epilogue to that is one donut belly was killed by a grenade shortly after, and another was actually stabbed by the troops themselves. And I was like, Jesus Christ. And like, I know that's kind of just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the violence and the sexual violence that has occurred in different parts of the world at different points in time. I mean, you brought up the I'm going to pronounce this
the
wrong.
Mahmadiyya massacre.
Yeah, where just a horrific event in Iraq where whole
14-year-old
family,
Iraqi girl.
yeah,
I don't know this story.
raped and murdered.
Oh,
Yeah.
Jesus.
But that's just
But it's interesting. In that case, again, it was the actual rape and the murder was carried out by a number of enlisted soldiers. But they were the only ones who really faced any substantive justice on the matter. The high-ranking officers who were in charge of that operational environment and presided over these killings, none of them faced any charge. There's a great book called Black Hearts. It's kind of a trope within the military community because it's recommended by dipshit officers who make you read it so that you enforce grooming standards on your men. But the main thrust of it is that none of these commanders were conducting proper battlefield circulation. And you have a war crime like this happen. But and the book kind of fails in this regard too, but no war crime happens at the tactical level nor at the operational. It happens at the strategic level at the top. So you mentioned, the violence against women in Vietnam. Everyone knows about the My Lai massacre. We're talking about the Ahmadiyya massacre right now. But the point is that this is the normal state of affairs, and unfortunately, these are only the particular cases we know about. But the amount of incidents like this are commonplace. And the generals and the higher-ranking officers who directly set the conditions that result in these actions happening never had to face the music for them.
So to bring that, I think, very, very, very well put together analysis down to the real world level, if you have a strategy of a counterinsurgency campaign, let's say in a place like Iraq, and it involves kicking down the doors of like regular ass people in cities and towns in Iraq or elsewhere and invading their privacy and harassing them in that sort of way, you're saying that's like systemically that violence is already there. It is prone to happen, and that is part of the strategy. And so you can't this attempt to disown it because there's a couple bad apples is complete bad faith and total diversion.
Absolutely. Again, I can't emphasize that you have figures, whether it's Petraeus, McChrystal, any of them, they themselves embody the mentality of dominating and inflicting violence on people who are beneath you, who aren't part of this warrior caste that you represent. And they directly influence the officers below them, and then the officers below them, and then the enlisted soldiers who carry out these actions.
So in that sense, it should not be surprising at all when people come home and beat their wives or just continue the cycle of violence that has been taught to them and like actually sent to them as orders. Right?
It's not surprising whatsoever because that type of behavior is normalized and accepted in military culture.
And I just gotta say, just as a broad point right here, like, if you're the kind of person out there that is going to call like a rank and file grunt a baby killer, or you're going to shame them in public because of the situation that they were in, regardless of the circumstance, you can go fuck yourself, because these are people that are put under very extreme conditions. This, as Jamie pointed out, conception of all volunteer army is kind of bullshit when you look at the economic conditions that bring rise to this. And these troops, whether they do horrific things or just the normal things that happen in the military, are by and large working class people, and whether they're abroad or whether they're at home, they are potential comrades. You cannot write them off. They are part of us, and hopefully, and I think that Spenser, you're going to talk a bit about this, hopefully they can be a very important and crucial part in trying to dismantle and destroy these structures of imperialism and capitalism that are doing so much damage right now in the world, and if we don't stop now, could potentially, I don't know, destroy the entire human race.
Yeah, and so to get into that, a very important question, I want to preface it by saying there is nothing that the capitalist class loves more than the idea that the military is an all-volunteer force, because it plays directly into the neoliberal ideology of everyone makes their own decisions, and that's the result of their financial situation they're in. You just got to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. There's ways to get out of a poor situation. It's all an individual effort, and there's no systemic quality to it. So whenever you try to, peddle that narrative, it plays directly into the hands of the ruling class. But again, we surrender the organizing efforts to reach out to military personnel at our own peril, quite frankly, because there are no people better equipped to speak to the Kafkaesque lifestyle of being a soldier than those who have directly participated in it, forever how short or long they might have done it. And in terms of an authentic internationalist socialist perspective, I mean, any socialist movement worth its salt over the past 100, 200 years has had a large component of disaffected military veterans who recognized their complicity and role in imperialist violence and joined up with the masses to overturn the conditions which cause such things to occur. Now, of course, there's no question that the military of the United States of America in 2018 is vastly different from the Portuguese army of the early 70s, from the Russian Imperial Army of the early 20th century, but there are still direct parallels, and there are still common features to the capitalist mode of production that exists today. And if you agree with Marx's overall analysis of capitalism, then that extends to the role of the military in capitalist violence as well.
Hell yeah. Well, maybe this belongs in the prior section, but this just popped into my head. Like, are there good things about the military that we should try to replicate as socialists? Because it sounds to me like part of the distress when people come home and have to live in neoliberal hell world is there are some things about the military that are actually fairly socialist, right? They have a sense of community and belonging and like all for one and one for all. They have
camaraderie comes from a military perspective.
Indeed.
Right?
3 meals a day.
Yeah.
They have a place to sleep. They have a lot of things that, you know, neoliberal society doesn't provide, right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the military runs on communist principles, but it propagandizes its members against them very early on. So it's the beautiful type of contradiction that the United States military loves to get itself into, because the military could not function without there being some degree of community or common objective and effort. So yes, absolutely. The idea of having a group or a collective who's operating in tandem with one another towards a common effort is very important for the left to grapple with and understand that maybe, you know, the skills a soldier brings to the table is not just being able to fire a gun or kill someone, but know how to organize and work as a member of a team effectively, and knowing how to navigate conflicting personalities and perspectives while still having a common goal and a common operating picture with which we can all rally around.
So the trick would then be to try to take those positive aspects, and I think, as you said before, try to I guess denude them of this jingoistic, neoliberal, violent, underpinning of it, right? And try to kind of move it to another phase, to do a phase change, and to try to use that in order to fight the ruling class instead of, say, go fight a bunch of brown peasants in a field somewhere.
And again, and I spoke to the communist principles of, working together from each according to their ability, each according to their need. But you have that in tandem with a brutally hierarchical rank structure, vast differences in pay and benefits for those who are, higher ranking officers versus lower enlisted. And that's where, the resolution of the contradictions comes into play. And again, it's tied to a larger socialist movement.
So one of the most exciting, shall we say, tantalizing parts of your talk at the Socialism Conference was where you said that you believe that the U.S. military can be defeated in the fight for global proletarian revolution. And that's a really important and exciting and kind of taboo question for leftists today, because, talking about revolution in a direct way in the U.S., it definitely will get you on a list somewhere. But I think it's a really important thing that leftists need to think about as more than just an abstraction. Like first, do you think that revolution is possible here in the heart of empire? And how do you think we're going to win? Is it just by getting everyone to desert the army and gain class consciousness, or is there more to it than that?
So To answer your first question, I do think that not only is revolution possible in the heart of empire, but it's absolutely necessary for there to be a successful internationalist socialist revolution.
Hell yeah.
When I say that the U.S. military can be defeated, I'm not just trying to be provocative. I'm trying to emphasize that although it might seem daunting to engage the United States military in a pitched battle of sorts, there are other elements that make up the military as an institution and as a structure wherein they can be affected and utilized to tear the military down piece by piece. To invoke Gramsci once again, he has this idea of revolution constituting two features. You have the war of position and the war of maneuver. Now, the war of maneuver is a direct action struggle as we know it, whether it's actually a kinetic engagement or more of like a work stoppage or a strike. But the war of position is the more molecular aspect of it, like we've discussed in this show, wherein you're reformulating concepts and ideas and engaging with people and organizing them to recognize that there is another way. The war of position is what is the necessary foothold to secure in any revolutionary movement for it to be successful in the long term. And so whether it's you're organizing various splinters within the military, you're engaging in different anti-imperialist projects to bring soldiers into the fold, all of them play a larger part in creating a collective consensus that can overturn the military structure, such as it is. The military itself is also an inherently contradictory entity, which is destroying itself from within. Whether it's the overabundance of spending on failed projects like the F-35, or just the endless amount of deployments of troops to places like Afghanistan and Iraq, Lenin was right in saying that the capitalists will sell us the ropes from which we will hang them. The military cannot sustain the effort it is currently putting out across the world. When you have over 800 military bases worldwide, that's going to eventually have to be answered, and it's probably going to look like a form of collapse. So when I say the military can be defeated, what I mean is that we need to organize alongside those who are in the military and are willing to challenge it directly, and reach out to those who might be questioning it and express to them, in keeping with this idea of the war of position, that there is another way forward, that there is a way to put a stop to ending the war, which is more than just saying, hey, it's over, we're bringing troops home. No. It's about changing our very foundational features of the society we live in. And from that, if we secure a foothold in the war of position, I think we can move into more of a direct war of maneuver and see the military collapse before our eyes.
Hell yeah.
Hell fucking yeah.
I think we'd like to end every episode with a bit of a call to arms, so to speak. Sometimes it's more literal than others. So I guess maybe I'd like you to play us out by answering one final question, and that is, do you really think that communism will win?
Communism will win.
Communism is necessary. Communism will win. And I have no doubt in my mind that in our lifetimes, we're going to see that happen.
Hell yeah.
Hell fucking yeah.